Some of my favorite live gigs. When I was a kid, I was lucky to hear a lot of music when I was very young. Heard Maynard Ferguson live when I was 13. I was a trumpet player, and that, of course, totally blew my mind. Maynard was an amazing musician, and I was like 13 years old, went to see him, maybe 14. Just incredible, just fantastic. And went backstage afterwards, talked to him. I think one of the things that's really interesting about that night was there were a couple of guys in the band who weren't that much older than me at the time. They were in their 20s. One was a baritone sax player named Ronnie Cuber, and another was a piano player and arranger named Micah Benny. I think it's working now. And later on, in my adult life, I would get to know these guys. They would be my friends. And as fate would have it, I guess I was destined for this life. I wrote the liner notes in 1994 for the Mosaic Records box set, Maynard Ferguson, the complete roulette recordings. These are the records that I listened to when I was a kid. Maynard 61, 62, 63, the first one, Message from Birdland. That music blew my mind. It still blows my mind. I think it's some of the best big band music ever recorded. Everyone has their own opinion on that. I mean, there's been a lot of great big bands, very distinctive sounds. I was very lucky. I saw Duke Ellington live when I was in high school. Came to my high school. This is 1964, I believe. I remember Duke being a very, very cool guy. That was very interesting. And Johnny Hodges, alto, very, very smooth sound. I love that. And Cat Anderson's trumpet. Cat Anderson was a man who could play in the higher register. And that was great. I also saw the Basie Band. I mean, by the time I was 15, because I lived in a city that was in between New York and Boston, and these different groups would come through, I saw Maynard Ferguson, I saw Duke Ellington, I saw Count Basie, I saw Stan Kenton. My dad was a big Stan Kenton fan, so he took me to that. That was fantastic. But Maynard, what happened was, always loved his music. In the 90s, a friend of mine who's since passed, a very close friend, Bob Belden, his buddy was Michael Cascuna of Mosaic Records, and when Belden found out that Mosaic was going to be releasing the roulette recordings, he got me the job to write the booklet. Unfortunately, that Mosaic, that 10 CD set is no longer in print. You can buy it on eBay or Amazon in the used department, but sadly you can't get it anymore. And I got to interview all these guys that I've been listening to, and I tried to interview Maynard, and he would not talk to me. I tried to contact him 3 or 4 times, and I was very disappointed because I wanted to interview him about the recording. I talked to him when I was 14 backstage after a concert. You know, Maynard was an incredible person, but he would not talk to me. I found out the reason he would not talk to me is because Roulette Records was owned by Morris Levy, who also owned Birdland. And Morris Levy was a Jewish mobster. He was connected to the mafia. And if he liked you, he recorded you and let you play it at the club, Birdland. But if he didn't like you, he'd send somebody after you with a baseball bat. So Maynard recorded a number of recordings for him over 3 or 4 years that ended up being released over 6 or 7 years. But it was not a good relationship, although Maynard played the club a number of times. He was not treated with the respect I think that he deserves. Jewish media, Jewish mafia, yeah. Well, there was a Jewish mafia. There were Jewish gangsters. So when I went to talk to Maynard, would not talk to me, which is a great disappointment. But I still did the booklet. I know I did a good job. It was a lot of fun to do it. And then in 1998, when Maynard had his 70th birthday, I was assigned by Jazz Times Magazine to do an interview with him. So I finally got to sit down with him, and actually I videoed it. And if you look here on YouTube, you can find the interview. I'll put a link in the description of this presentation. And, you know, just an amazing man, fascinating guy, great trumpet player. This is a guy who spent most of his life driving around in a bus and playing in junior high schools and getting kids excited about music and having a lot of great musicians pass through his band and very supportive. So seeing him in person when I was a kid was just incredible. And I continued to see gigs in the Hartford area, and then I started to go to New York. There used to be these Sunday sessions at the Village Vanguard. I saw John Handy there. I also went to a session in 1966, I believe, at the Village Vanguard. We came in for a couple days, lived about 100 miles away, so we would come in, try to stay with family or friends. And I saw the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra when they first got together on a double bill with Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins was at the end of his life. This was when he had a beard. He looked kind of like a rabbi. And don't really remember. You know, it's interesting as you look back. Some of these things really stand out. Others are just, well, I saw such and such, but no musical memory of that particular night. And then when I finally moved to New York in the late 60s, I went to NYU Film School. That's when the dam broke open, and I just started to go hear live music all the time. At the Village Vanguard, at Slugs, and then at the Fillmore East. Although deep into jazz, I'm a baby boomer, a guy from the 60s, so I was part of all that music that happened. And I went to a gig, not at the Fillmore East, but at the Boston Globe Jazz Festival in 1970 with Rahsaan Roland Kirk sitting in with the Mothers of Invention. Now that was memorable. I had seen Rahsaan in Hartford, I guess in 65 or 66, and was a huge fan of his. Always loved his music from the first time I heard it. And Rahsaan was an adventurist. And at the Boston Globe Jazz Festival, at that time, the barriers were like breaking down between what is this, what is this. Musicians were trying different things. The fusion era was beginning. Myles and Herbie and Wayne and Joe Zawinul, they were like opening closed doors, trying all kinds of different things. Irgun Ilmaz says, I'm a big fan of Rahsaan Roland. Yeah, where are you from? And how do you say your name? Are you Turkish, by the way? So Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. This is when they were blowing more. As his music developed, it became more satire, more vocals. But at that point, he had some really good players in the band. And they were improvising. And Rahsaan came out on stage. And he sat in with Frank Zappa. And they like Zappa's guitar and Rahsaan's saxophone. I mean, they just instant connection. And I remember at one point, Rahsaan was playing a solo, and we've got to remember this guy was blind. Rahsaan was playing a solo, and he got down and he laid down on his back, and he was playing the saxophone on his back, and all the guys in the band got down and they laid on their backs as well. And wow, that was unbelievable. I saw Rahsaan, I guess about a year later at the Village Vanguard. He used to play there every Christmas, New Year's, that week. And I went down there one night, and he was playing. And once again, I remind you that this man was blind. He started playing, and then he walked from the bandstand. No one's guiding him. He walked from the bandstand out the club, up the stairs to the street. The door was open. We could hear him playing outside. And then he made his way back downstairs and got back on the bandstand. It was just unbelievable. Sadly, a few years later, he had a stroke. And he could only play with one hand. And he did a concert at Town Hall in New York. I went to see him. I went to that concert. And he played more with one hand that night than most people could play with two. He was fantastic. I miss him tremendously. Do yourself a favor and pick up his album, Return of the 5,000-Pound Man, a recording he did for Warner Brothers a year or two before he passed. Just an incredible player. And I saw Myles for the first time in 1969 at the Fillmore East. He was on a triple bill that night with Neil Young and Crazy Horse and the Steve Miller Band. I had never seen Myles live. I was heavily following Myles during that period. I remember it was very exciting because the music was changing. I remember when Myles came out with In a Silent Way. It was very different than anything he had done. Myles sounds the same, but he puts himself in a different context. And with the band that he had at the time, he recorded In a Silent Way, and then, excuse me, Bitches Brew. After In a Silent Way, we were waiting. What's he going to do next? And then he came out with Bitches Brew. And I saw him right after Bitches Brew was released at the Fillmore in '69. The band was Chick Corea, Wayne Shorter, Dave Holland, and Jack DeJohnette. And that recording was subsequently released on Columbia. And it was great. And then I guess a year later or 2 years later, I forget my exact dates, he came back to the Fillmore on a double bill with a very beautiful, wonderful singer and writer named Laura Nero, who has since passed. And he came out first, and then she, after intermission, she was going to come out. He came out on the stage. First of all, there were two keyboards on the stage. When I had seen him a year before, it was just Chick Corea. But there were two keyboards on the stage, and the guys came out, and on one side of the stage, there was a Farfisa electric organ. Keith Jarrett walked out and he played that. On the other side was Chick Corea on electric piano. Steve Grossman was the sax player in the band at that point, and he also had Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette and a Brazilian percussionist named Ayrton. And I was a fan of Keith Jarrett. I had seen I heard Keith Jarrett with Charles Lloyd when Charles Lloyd released the recording Forest Flower. I think I was a junior or a senior in high school. That totally blew my mind. His piano playing on that I still listen to that Forest Flower solo. I mean, it just jumps out at me. Just incredible. So here, and he was playing with Charles Lloyd. And I'd seen Charles Lloyd a couple times before. In fact, in that same theater, before it was the Fillmore East, it was the Village Theater, and I had seen Charles Lloyd Quartet there with Keith Jarrett in maybe November of '67. So here we are in '70, and Keith Jarrett is playing with Myles. There's two keyboard players, Keith and Chick Corea. And the music just totally blew my mind that night. That has since come out on a recording called Myles at Fillmore. Excerpts from all four nights. I was so blown away by the music that night that I just left. I just didn't want to hear anything else. I never saw Laura Nero, unfortunately. I'm sure that she was great that night. but I did not see that. Listened to the recording, but Myles just totally blew me away. And then I guess about a year after that, I saw Myles at the Cafe A Go-Go, except the band had changed. Steve Grossman had left the band, and it was Gary Bartz. And Dave Holland had also left the band, and it was Michael Henderson. So it was, the band was Keith Jarrett, Michael Henderson on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums, and Airto and Gary Bartz. Also incredible. Well, that particular night was one of my great nights in terms of hearing live music. I don't know if there's any officers of the law here, but I will tell you that that particular night, I dropped some acid before I went to the Cafe A Go-Go. And it was a double bill at the Cafe A Go-Go. It was Richard Pryor and Miles Davis. And I'd seen Richard Pryor on TV a little bit, but I was unprepared for the flow of obscenities that came from his mouth, especially since I was on acid. I mean, it was just wild. And then Myles came out, and the music, oh man. I felt so connected to that music that night. Acid will do that. Well, that's only part of it, because after that, we went to the Village Vanguard. It was the opening night. It was a Tuesday night. It was the opening night debut of Chick Corea's new band called Circle. After Chick and Dave Holland, they left together, left Myles, they formed a group called Circle. Circle was totally different than the music he was playing with Myles. Myles was doing the fusion thing. Chick had played on In a Silent Way, and I believe he plays on Bitches Brew. And yes, it was Orange Sunshine, Mr. Robinson. You are correct about that. I was on Orange Sunshine. I love that acid. So Chick was playing very avant-garde, very out. They were joined by an excellent drummer named Barry Altschuld and Anthony Braxton. Now, if you know Anthony Braxton, he is an avant-garde, whatever, free jazz, whatever you want to describe it. So the music they were playing with Circle, and you can go back and you can hear it on ECM Records, couldn't be further from what I heard with Myles that night. I loved it. I thought it was great. Anthony Braxton, when he plays, his neck blares out. And I was hallucinating off of his neck and like the pipes in the ceiling. Just totally blew me away. And I was sitting there in the Vanguard and I was listening to this music, and all of a sudden there was like a break between the songs, a little bit of silence. And this elderly woman walked down the stairs at the Vanguard, and she walked in. If you've ever been to the Vanguard, you walk down the stairs and there's like a little gate at the desk at the front, and someone greets you and you pay them and so forth. So she walked down. I don't know who was on the door that night. There was a bartender who worked there named Mickey. Maybe it was him. I don't know. So anyway, down the stairs, this woman and Circle, Chick Corea and Anthony Braxton are like getting ready to play another number. And she said, with a British accent, she said, loud enough so everybody in the club could hear, "Is it very avant-garde?" Just as she said that, they launched into this. She was like, and she got turned around and walked back up the stairs. I guess that was too much for her. Yeah, that was one of those nights. One of those, something you remember for a lifetime. I've had a number of gigs like that. I remember a gig, it was at Carnegie Hall. I think it was in May of '74, if I'm not mistaken. It was a triple bill. And I'm going to say some names here that some of you may or may not know, because sometimes people don't remember. But it was a triple bill of Lonnie Liston Smith and the Cosmic Echoes, Carlos Garnett, and Doug Karn. I was a huge Lonnie Liston Smith and the Cosmic Echoes fan, and I was a huge Doug Karn fan. I liked Carlos Garnett. He was a sax player from Panama who came to New York in the '70s, recorded some albums, Played with Myles for a while and then had some personal problems, dropped out. I don't know where he is today. Lonnie Liston Smith was a fantastic, is still a great piano player. He played with Rahsaan Roland Kirk, and then Pharoah Sanders. Played a lot with Pharoah Sanders. I had seen Lonnie Liston Smith with Pharoah Sanders at the Vanguard, and also I had seen Lonnie Liston Smith with Gato Barbieri. That was wonderful at the Village Gate. So Lonnie Liston Smith formed his own band, the Cosmic Echoes. After on the Pharoah Sanders recording Themby, he first touched the electric piano and in the studio that day and played on a track called Astral Traveling. You can find that here on YouTube. Both the Pharoah Sanders version and Lonnie Smith did a solo album, then formed his own group called the Cosmic Echoes. So they were on the bill with Carlos Garnett and then Doug Karn. Doug Karn recorded 2 or 3 incredible albums for a label called Black Jazz in the mid-'70s with his then wife Jean Karn, who was a vocalist. And I still love that music. I still go back to that music. Jean Karn had left the band for this particular gig, but Doug Karn is a great organist and pianist. And that concert, I don't know if my friend Julie Loken of New Audience Productions produced a lot of those concerts. I don't know if he did that concert that night, but I really, really dug that music that night. It stayed with me. It continues to stay with me. That's the thing about this, about all these gigs, all these club dates and concert dates, and I've had a very lucky life being involved in this music and hearing all this music live, and it stays with you. And I have in the past 15 years moved to Tucson, Arizona, and I have those memories. And then I'm happy to report that I went to a gig in January as part of the Tucson Jazz Festival that also blew my mind, and that was Kamasi Washington. What he's doing now is fantastic. I'm a huge Kamasi Washington fan. And going to hear him live and hearing his music and seeing how the crowd reacts and what that's about brings me back to those days in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, 80s too. I mean, every decade has, I've seen great music in every decade. I'm a little bit isolated now in that I live in the Sonoran Desert, not that much live music. But there's still great live music out there. I encourage you to go see it. It's wonderful to listen to recordings. I hear here on YouTube now and Spotify and Apple Music. We have access to a lot of fantastic recordings, a lot of music throughout the entire history of jazz, but there's nothing like seeing live jazz in person, being at a gig, being in a club, going to a concert, a jazz festival. I've been to the North Sea Jazz Festival, the Newport Jazz Festival. Live music is very exciting. So those are a few of the gigs that I've seen in my life that I wanted to share with you. Maybe in the comments here you can leave some of yours. I'm going to continue working on this live stream thing until I get it right. I had planned to use B-roll here and cut to some album covers, but that didn't work out. But thanks for joining me, and I will